Welcome to Chapter 4, video number 3, American Life in the 17th Century. And today we're going to look at Southern society as compared to New England society. Slavery enriched masters, and the fruits of slave labor made England's southern colonies the richest in North America. By the 18th century, a distinctive social hierarchy of wealth and status had emerged in the southern colonies. Great merchant planters, the grandees, occupied the top of this social pyramid. Families who owned vast acres of land and gangs of slaves to work it were called grandees. Among these merchant planters were the Fitzhughs, the Lees, the Custises, and the Washingtons of Virginia, the so-called first families of Virginia, established before 1690 in Virginia's Tidewater region, who dominated the House of Burgesses. These merchant planters in Southern society controlled the economies and politics in their colonies and were hard-working businessmen who closely managed their plantations. Next in the social pyramid were the small yeoman farmers, those with smaller acreages who lived a subsistence lifestyle, worked their own land, and owned few, if any, slaves. Privately, the big planters looked down upon the lesser white yeoman farmers, but treated them as equals publicly. Yeoman farmers generally resented the planters, but appreciated the occasional favors and social order that they maintained. Below the yeoman farmers were landless whites, former indentured servants, freedmen, with little money and few prospects of rising higher in the South's social pyramid. Next in the hierarchy came indentured servants, working off their contracts to their masters, followed by the African slaves at the bottom of the South's social pyramid. The New England family. Life in the 17th century New England contrasted starkly with life in the South. The North's cooler climate and purer water enabled settlers to enjoy longer lifespans with fewer threats from epidemics of disease. Among New England's first Puritan settlers, lifespans averaged 70 years for males and only slightly less for females, an increase of 10 years over lifespans of Old England. The primary determinant in a woman's lifespan was childbirth. Women averaged 10 pregnancies, of which 8 survived. This translated to nearly 1 baby every 2 years until menopause. In New England, childbirthing and childcare was a full-time task, a role which filled women with fears of dying in childbirth and which physically drained them. One reason for a woman's near total submission to her husband can best be expressed in the sentiment then common in Europe and America: a true wife accounts subjection her honor. Despite the risks of childbirth and life in the frontier New England, the longevity of New Englanders contributed to family stability. It was common for children to grow up knowing both their parents and their grandparents. Family stability thus contributed to low premarital pregnancy rates and a stronger social structure. Women's property rights in New England differed from those in the South. In New England, men lived longer and retained rights to all property because lawmakers believed recognizing a woman's separate property rights would undermine marital unity. Divorces were rare and were generally granted only for abandonment or adultery. A woman convicted of adultery was usually whipped and forced to wear an A sewn to her outer clothing, as in the 1850 tale, The Scarlet Letter. Life in New England towns. New England's growing population competed for a limited amount of land because Indian tribes such as the Iroquois and the Mohicans existed there as well. These tribes fiercely guarded their lands against encroachment along the western and northern frontiers. Over time, it became the practice for town councils to request land grants from the colonial legislatures to move families wishing to establish new towns. Towns consisting of 50 families or more were required to establish a tax-supported elementary school, a valued institution in teaching children reading and writing so they could study the Bible. Towns had a meeting house, which served as both town hall and a place of worship. These meeting houses were surrounded by houses, and a village green was used for militia drills and other activities. Towns held meetings to elect officials, select schoolmasters, and handle routine business, and voting was limited to adult males. In 1636, Massachusetts Puritans established Harvard College to train young men for the ministry. New Englanders developed trade networks connecting to Boston merchants, moneylenders, and to Atlantic commerce, something that they came to value dearly. New England farmers grew a variety of small crops and raised livestock to meet their needs. If a surplus was produced, it was traded, sold to neighbors, or exported to other colonial markets and the wider Atlantic world. New Englanders became known for shipbuilding and fishing in the rich waters off Newfoundland. By the 18th century, fish constituted over 33% of its exports. In addition, they developed reputations for Puritanistic consciences, idealism, and for Yankee ingenuity, the latter being an ability to improvise, invent, and make do in the tough northeastern climate. The Halfway Covenant and the Salem Witch Trials. In the 1640s and 1650s, New England Puritan leaders expressed alarm at declining church membership and a perceived watering down of orthodox Puritan beliefs. These changes were attributable to New England's growing population, the dispersal of families to new towns, which weakened people's ties to church and neighbors, and a weakening of religious zeal associated with the first generation of Puritan colonists. In the 1650s, Puritan ministers tried to renew that zeal through the Jeremiad, a new form of sermon which berated parishioners for their declining piety and testimonials of personal conversion with God. This is a colonial primer which was used for religious instruction, and this was commonly done in colonial schools. This textbook taught lessons of social duty and Christian faith as well as reading and writing. In 1652, the Puritan Congregational Church adopted the Halfway Covenant and hoped for a hoped solution in which, number one, unconverted children became halfway members in the church without voting privileges, and number two, they could baptize their infants in the church but could not take communion. The Halfway Covenant diluted distinctions between the elect and others, an unintended consequence which illustrated the difficulty of maintaining religious zeal. In time, Puritan churches relaxed membership even more by welcoming all, whether converted or not, a fact corresponding to the rise of women as a majority in the church. Puritanism's failure to achieve complete success in fulfilling the promise of a godly society ultimately undermined its appeal, a fact manifested in the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. In 1692, more than 100 people were accused of witchcraft. Most were middle-class women from merchant families, charged with worshiping Satan and bedeviling those who had accused them. The witch trials clearly illustrated the erosion of religious confidence. Poor people came to resent the wealth and sins of others more than they were concerned with their own sins. The accusers came from poor subsistence farm families on the town's outskirts. Of those accused of witchcraft, 20 were executed by various means, most by hanging, and one was pressed to death. So in this map of Salem in 1692, which we'll also look at in our classroom activity, the bad economy in Salem village with the poor farmers, and basically they struggled, while Salem town had wealthy merchants and a seaport, and they were prospering. But Salem villagers who lived next to the busy roads also prospered from the commerce of Salem town, which created a Salem village between wealthier tradesmen, merchants, and their poorer farming neighbors, who believed that worldliness and affluence threatened their Puritan values. Most of the accused witches lived near roads, while their accusers lived on the farms. The majority of American settlers were farmers who worked from sunup to sundown, preparing and planting fields in the spring, tending crops in the summer, and harvesting in the fall. After dinner at sundown, they generally went to bed unless there was important work to be done, and then only if it was worth the candle. On northern farms or southern plantations, women, slave or free, were responsible for cooking, cleaning, childcare, weaving, and other stereotypical women's work. Men handled the tasks of clearing land and planting, tending crops and livestock, cutting firewood, and other typical men's work. Children helped if they were old enough. In the middle and northern colonies, most white migrants came from neither the aristocracy nor the lowest classes of European citizenry, with the exception of the indentured servants. In frontier colonial America, pretensions and displays of class were not welcomed nor followed, particularly in the more egalitarian Middle and New England colonies. Still, American settlers considered themselves different and of a better sort than those who remained in England or Europe, pointing to their success in building a new social structure modified through democratic influences with elements of what was familiar from the Old World. Upper-class pretensions often generated resentment and fomented civil strife, such as Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, which we've already discussed, Leisler's Rebellion in New York from 1689 to 1691, and Code's Rebellion in Maryland. And we'll wrap up the chapter and continue our comparison of the Southern Society and the New England Society in our classroom activities.